This is an ongoing project, myself and a bunch of PhD students and postdocs that we've been doing for a few years now. And what it broadly is a conceptual, in essence, the PhD students are all targeting particular empirical areas, which I'll talk about briefly. But what it's really about is just saying that the sort of the Schumpeterian story of innovation trajectories that begins with entrepreneurship and the originating firms and then goes through and market failures and so on, that there's a missing phase to that story. And the phase is right at the very beginning. And the way in which we are introducing or sort of telling the story is that the missing person from the whole theory of entrepreneurship and innovation is Elinor Ostrom, and which then enables us to loop back into Hayek and a few others. But it's basically saying that this notion, there's a missing sort of institutional understanding of what is happening in the very, very beginning of the innovation trajectory. And that's what I want to talk, that's what we're calling the Innovation Commons. And Exhibit A in our story of the Innovation Commons is the Republic of Letters. Is what we think of that as just the very first and most powerful Innovation Commons. So the context of this is a way of sort of thinking about what actually is the innovation problem as an economic problem. And the standard model of this, which actually Dick Nelson invented back in a long time ago, is the sort of market failure conception of the economics of the production of knowledge, in the sense that that production of knowledge is a special case. It runs into this fundamental market failure problem, and therefore this becomes the innovation problem as an economic problem, the various resolutions of which are intellectual property and innovation policy and the like. The story that we want to tell is that there's another way of interpreting that, and that's to see it as fundamentally a problem of distributed knowledge in the Hayekian sense, and that distributed partial knowledge has to come together, and this is the Republic of Letters sort of metaphor here, has to come together in order to discover the entrepreneurial opportunity. And it's that sort of creating a common pool resource of distributed knowledge in order to reveal the opportunity that therefore makes entrepreneurship possible in the first place. Then we have the beginnings of the story of entrepreneurs and starting firms and the standard trajectory. And what our point here is, it's one of these things that we can't tell whether it's just a really obvious point that's almost too stupid to say out loud, or something that actually sort of contributes to this story as before the market failure problem is actually a collective action problem, i.e. one that's solved with private order governance rather than a government market failure type solution. Now, if that's the case, then we're missing the story of the institutions of innovation is missing some institutions, and those are the institutions broadly associated with clubs and commons. And you see this not in the latter stages of a trajectory, when it's firms and markets competing with each other. From that point perspective, it's all competition. You see it right at the very beginning, when uncertainty is off the charts, when everyone has a little piece of the information, but no one actually can see clearly what the actual opportunity is. In that situation, you've got a collective action problem that's resolved it could be resolved through just genius, right? If someone is smart enough to see the entire picture. So if we're just relying on a handful of small geniuses who can see through it, then that's the limited situation. But from a Smithian perspective, when we're dealing with a fundamental situation is distributed, partial information that needs to be pooled or cohered. That's the argument of the Innovation Commons is, from a transactions cost Williamson type perspective, the most efficient institution is not a firm or a market, but a commons, or a club-like situation. We're sort of running those two together. So what this then becomes is an alternative theory of the origin of innovation, or the origin of the innovation trajectory, that before the innovation story doesn't begin with, in the beginning is the brilliant entrepreneur, but rather in the beginning is a bunch of distributed knowledge and a bunch of people trying to figure out what's going on. And when institutions around the commons form to overcome that extreme uncertainty, we then have a situation when entrepreneurs can then emerge. And thus there's the story. So this is pretty much what happens at the beginning. So look, I mean, that's kind of the whole story. Let me just run through what I'm going to do just quickly here. So there's two parts to this. One is the theory of the innovation commons, about what's going on in that part of it. And then the second part of it that's just in the paper that I want to then point out is that if you buy that story, the story of the significance of the institutions of the innovation commons, then an implication of that is actually that the Kersnerian story is not complete either. Because the Kersnerian story also relies on an individual alert entrepreneur spotting an opportunity in markets by seeing an arbitrage opportunity. What we've got here then is that societies that can develop institutions of the innovation commons can therefore engage in what we're going to call higher order entrepreneurial discovery, which is basically a collective action model of that. So that's kind of the overview. So the theory underlying this is that the resources that are required as inputs into innovation are basically two broad types. And most of the sort of standard story focuses only on the first. So the first one, and this is the one where you get all the market failures that are manifest, is just stuff, right? The synchrotrons, the equipment, the test labs, the things that you have to spend money on to do this stuff, and that are normally resolved with finance and a firm and or public provision of those things. But the other innovation resource is in the sort of sense of information that an entrepreneur requires to piece together to reveal the opportunity, right? And this is in the sort of Danny Roddick sense of information about regulatory barriers, or just information about potential costs and information about what is available where. It's market information, but it's not necessarily price information. A lot of it is non-price information, a lot of it is tacit. This is the stuff you can't patent, this is the stuff you can't protect. This is the stuff that is often distributed and is not really even, doesn't necessarily have value in its individual pieces, but only when it's combined and put together to reveal an opportunity. So what the sort of argument here is that at the very, very beginning of an innovation process, there will often be value in creating a common pool resource, again in the Ostrom sense, of that information. But obviously this runs into an issue here of there's a collective action problem in that, in the sense that you've got the risk of free riders, of I'll give you my information, but how do I know you're going to share yours? So you've got a classic sort of tragedy of the commons problem here. But if that can be resolved, then everyone in that space has now got the information they need to possibly be the one that can discover the opportunity, and thus it's a rich space for a potential entrepreneur to be in if that common pool resource can be created. And the point here is that common pool resource is not just of the stuff, the kit. It's more crucially and more fundamentally of the information underneath it. So this is kind of the theory that we build. The logic, the sort of economic logic of this is just to recognize that, you say, why the commons? Well, this is not just a production cost problem, it's a transactions cost problem as well. Again, a sort of obvious point, but once we sort of open that out, the paper sort of has built this out, and there's a bunch of other things that we're writing around this as well that develop this logic, but we put it into a McCloskey, Hayek, Ostrom, Williamson model, really showing the sense in which the innovation commons can resolve is actually a transactions cost minimizing solution to that problem of pooling that information necessary to create an innovation, to create a opportunity, the discovery of an opportunity. So the way of thinking about this is, from the Schumpeterian perspective, is that there's basically a phase zero before the standard sort of three-phase trajectory. The standard Schumpeterian trajectory is in the beginning is the entrepreneur, starts the innovating firm, and then the second phase is kind of creative destruction, where you've got markets, and then the third phase is the mature industry, where the sort of, now, whatever point is that the standard story just starts at the beginning, when in the beginning is the genius single entrepreneur who sees the opportunity, and away we go. What we're arguing is actually potentially a phase before that. This notion of the innovation commons sits between the technical emergence of an idea, or a technology in the sort of engineering sense, and the discovery or conjecture of the existence of the entrepreneurial opportunity. And it's that transition that an innovation commons can, under certain circumstances, be the most efficient institution for that space. Sort of argue that firms can fill that space if they're large enough, or if the technology is concentrated enough, or if the firm happens to have most of the smart people in the world who are working in that thing inside of it, which in some cases has been the case. The sort of Bell Laboratories. There's a few examples of that, but this is kind of the thinking that we've got on this. The way we develop this as a logic, as I've indicated, is that there's basically four phases to it. This is in the Deirdre McCloskey bourgeois trilogy sense of it. In the beginning is the kind of social permissioning of innovation, right? That Joel pointed out in terms of the negative, overcoming the negative barriers, negative incentives. The Hayekian aspect of this is recognizing that you've got distributed knowledge or distributed information. And this is in the Hayek 1945 sense of that. Now Hayek's story then was, well, markets enable that information to be pooled. The story here is that a lot of that is actually non-price information, so we needed often a different institution. The Williamson aspect of this then kicks in. What people are doing is pooling idiosyncratic knowledge under the opportunism of being exploited. So you end up with that problem, and the resolution of this is essentially Ostrom's rules of the commons. And so what we've been then looking at is the way in which the sort of 8 classic Ostrom design rules of the commons actually map into the space of very early stage innovation behavior, and we're getting pretty much a one-to-one mapping story that we've been developing this through that. So that's kind of the overarching logic. The examples of this that we've been, so Republic of Letters is a fantastic example. The ones that we've been doing is we've been looking at 3D printing and hackerspaces. And what's interesting about them is this sort of amateur enthusiast club-like presence that you see everywhere in these things. These are technologies that are largely being developed by groups of very enthusiastic people coming together and pooling information about the particular hacks they've made, or the patches they've made, or the bits of information, the kit part of it. When you go in and actually study those groups, what's happening is that pooling and sharing of I'll give you my patch if you give me your patch, or is that is basically a screening mechanism, an efficient screening mechanism to get access to the real information that is of value, which is and we tried actually starting this thing, or we tried, and in relation to experiments around demand, in relation to the regulatory barriers they run into, or opportunities, or other entrepreneurially relevant information. So what you observe in these sort of hacker spaces or maker communities, or these sort of early technology enthusiast communities, are a lot of people who are not sort of explicitly saying, like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm here to do that, because no one would share information with you if that's the case. These are people who are coming here, they're all behaving cooperatively in this space, but they're doing it selectively, only with people who they suspect might also have other relevant, useful information. And so what we see then is that these function essentially as a commons. And what then happens is that the information is pooled to create a common pool resource, and at some point, that information, the inherent uncertainty falls to a level that someone can see, I see the opportunity. So one good example of this was the Homebrew Computer Club around Stanford in the 1970s, and Bill Gates was one of the members there. And at some point, it became apparent what the opportunity was to turn that into a business proposition. At that point, the commons collapsed, everyone ran for the door, and a wave of new businesses started. We're studying this through 3D printing, where it's now through that process. Blockchain and cryptocurrencies are currently going through this process where you're seeing a lot of cooperative, collective behavior, young sort of enthusiasts coming together, pooling information. Now, everyone wants to come out the other side as an entrepreneur, but the reason that they're behaving the way they are at the moment is that no one can quite see how to do that. Origin of new sports is another classic one where we see this everywhere. We've been going back through and looking at sort of early stages of mature industries, because what our hypothesis is that every new industry has this at the beginning. It just doesn't tend to leave a historical trail because it's not official, it's not formal. Once it's done its work, it collapses. And all right, so I've been given the wind-up, so I'll just end with the implication here of this, is that so that's the innovation commons theory. It's basically Ostrom plus Hayek applied to the bit that sits before Schumpeter. What the implication there is that this is actually also Hayek, but Hayek sort of 1972. This is the cultural group selection story, that groups that can cooperate to pull this information will outcompete groups that can't, precisely because of the higher expected rate of entrepreneurial discovery. That's the implication of the higher order discovery story, is that so societies that are just reliant on genius entrepreneurship will be outcompeted by groups that can institutionally develop these types of mechanisms to cooperate, to pull that information, which is, in terms of, from an evolutionary perspective, that's multi-level selection theory thereby applied. So, all right, I've been given the wind-up. So the implication then is that this then means, okay, the standard Schumpeterian framework is possibly institution not quite complete. There's a new sort of theory of the origin. The innovation problem fundamentally understood as a knowledge problem and not just a market failure problem. And the implication then for policies is interesting because the resolution of this, the solution here, is coming from private governance. It's coming from bottom up as a community is able to figure out how to cooperate. And when it does, it then creates the conditions for... so, yeah, there we go.